China is leading in so many technologies. It's leading in solar panel technology. It's leading in drone technology. It's leading in so many different aspects of technology. And there must be something about the way in which the whole system operates that is enabling all this.
70 years ago, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. And so in a sense, it was starting almost from scratch, So, I mean, this progress that it's made has been made just in a period of about 70 years, since the CPC came to power in 1949.
Hello and welcome to the 41st Geopolitical Economy Hour, the show that discusses the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of our world. I'm your host, Radhika Desai, and working behind the scenes to bring you this show every fortnight are Paul Graham, our videographer, and Eklavya Jain, our transcriber. China had a special present for President Trump on his inauguration. On that day, Chinese AI startup DeepSeek revealed the R1 LLM, or large language model, that performed as well or better than its Western counterparts, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, and did so at a fraction of the cost, and at a fraction, one might add, in our times of climate change, of energy use. This was a big deal. It wiped out $600 billion of the valuation of NVIDIA, although, of course, now we are, buy the dip, in a buy the dip territory, so people are buying it again. NVIDIA is, of course, the giant maker of advanced computer chips. It also wiped off nearly $1 trillion of the technology-heavy US stock markets. Silicon Valley had to admit that DeepSeek's R1 was indeed an excellent performer. However big though this deal was, this achievement of China's is not an exception. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute has a device called the Critical Technology Tracker, which over the past couple of years since it was started has taken to tracking some 64 different critical technologies, and takes its database back to the early 2000s. Last August, it reported and I'm quoting them now, a stunning shift in research leadership over the past 2 decades towards large economies in the Indo-Pacific led by China's exceptional gains. The US led in 60 of 64 technologies in the 5 years from 2003 to 2007. But in the most recent 5 years, 2019 to 2023, is leading in 7. China led in just 3 of the 64 technologies in 2003 to 2007, but is now the lead country in 57 of the 64 technologies, increasing its leads from our rankings from last year, where it was leading in 52 technologies. That's the end of the ASPI Critical Technology Tracker quote. And this is happening despite the fact that the United States is using some by now well-honed tech techniques to try to stem China's technological advance, whether it involves closing its market to Chinese companies, such as happened to Huawei and ZTE, or restricting the export of high technology products and components, and many, many others. And if this were not enough, since 2023, President Xi Jinping has proclaimed that one of the major goals of his government is to promote industrial innovation, and I'm quoting him now, to promote industrial innovation through scientific and technological innovation, especially disruptive and cutting-edge technologies, to spawn new industries, new models, new drivers, and develop new productive forces. That's what he said. So these developments, DeepSeek and the more generally leading position that China is taking in major technological fields, in cutting-edge technologies, upend so much of our received wisdom on innovation and what it takes to be innovative, what it takes to have technological breakthroughs, and so on. We are always told that free market economies are innovative. We are always told that the private sector produces innovation. We are told that innovation involves creative destruction. So, if you are feeling some pain because of some new technology, don't be a Luddite. This is part of the process that we have to go through in order to realize the gains of technology. We are told that Western countries have and will always retain the lead in science and technology, that capitalism is always better at innovation. But all of this has been upended. And indeed, there's something else that's happening. When President Xi used the expression new productive forces or new quality productive forces, he was, of course, recalling Marx. Marx had long been thought to have been, Marx is, of course, pilloried generally in the West. But if there's one thing in particular that he is essentially credited with being completely wrong about, is the idea that at some point, capitalism would stop being able to develop the productive forces. Most thinkers in the West, including most people who consider themselves Marxists, appear to believe that capitalism is the best at developing the technological forces, the productive forces that humanity is capable of. Socialism is generally regarded as an innovation basket case. So are we at a stage of history when we need to revisit this so widely held truth? What is really going on? So with me to discuss this is a geopolitical economy, our regular Professor Mick Dunford of Sussex University and the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, where he's based currently, and from where he's able to watch closely from within, as it were, how China's development and its productive system and its innovation system and many other systems actually work. So Mick, perhaps you can start us off with generally your impression and your understanding of DeepSeek, what it's managed to achieve and what it tells us about what China is able to do today vis-a-vis the West and in particular the US.
All right. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you very much. I think you made a number of extremely important points in your introduction about the implications of the launch of DeepSeek version 3. I mean, it's deeply ironic, isn't it, that Trump and the US, a group of US oligarchs announced a $500 billion Stargate infrastructure program, which is designed to make the United States the leader in the next generation of critical technologies. The very next day, Mark Zuckerberg announced a $65 billion investment by Meta. And he said it was made because we want the US to set the global AI standard and not China. Now, one of the interesting things about this initiative, of course, was that it is associated with the idea that only the US has the financial resources and the technology that enables it to establish a strong position at the frontier of the next generation of new technologies, and that the United States was going to dominate the artificial intelligence revolution just as it had dominated the IT revolution. But one of the things I immediately found very curious was that actually the money they were looking for was to come not just from the United States, but to a significant extent from the Middle East, from Japan, and from other countries, and was to be actually pulled into the United States to invest in these artificial intelligence systems in order that the United States could establish global leadership. So it was the next day, the Chinese announced DeepSeek version 3. And then very shortly afterwards, Alibaba declared its new QN 2.5 system completed and claimed that it actually outperformed OpenAI's ChatGPT and Meta's latest models, as well as claiming that it outperformed DeepSeek. I mean, as you made several very important points about DeepSeek. I mean, the first is that it was trained in what, 1/10 of the time that it took to train Llama 3.1, and it cost a fraction of the cost of the US system. So, I mean, it cost 5.6 million. It used 2,000 NVIDIA H800 graphics processing units instead of spending 80 billion. Was it? Or no, it was 80 million to 100 million. 80 million. It was 80 million. 80 million to 100 million, wasn't it? In the case of GPT-4. So it required much less processing power. It was much, much more economical. It produced its results in a much, much shorter period of time. And yeah, in spite of that, I mean, there's been a whole series of comparisons looking at the performance of DeepSeek 3 compared with other technologies. And it actually seems that it can actually outperform, Llama 3.1, it can outperform GPT 4.440 on a whole series of key benchmarks. And it gets exceptional scores in relation to coding and mathematics. So in coding, it actually dominated something like 5 of the 7 benchmarks on which it was tested. So this is a very, very striking result, that a system, that involved substantially less cost, substantially less time, could actually outperform much, much more expensive systems on a set of performance standards that are widely used. Then the third step was that DeepSeek was made open source rather than proprietary, which enables it to be used by others. So the minute that announcement was made, it sort of resembled in many ways, the conflict that occurs between the production of generic and branded pharmaceuticals. And it's very, very striking, that actually the reason why the BRICS was originally established by 3 countries, right, by India, South Africa, and Brazil, was because Brazil and South Africa had serious AIDS crises, and India had the capacity to produce generic pharmaceuticals that would enable these countries to address this terrible problem that they confronted. But they were impeded from doing so by international trade rules set and enforced, by the United States and Europe. So this is an extraordinary contrast, because, I mean, development and human progress depends upon the spread of technology. It depends on it's being made available to everyone rather than it being confined to a small section of the world, but essentially by being monopolized by a small group of giant corporations that can then charge exceptionally high rents, for these products, and that can prevent, if you like, generic technologies from being made more widely available. And then, the next thing that happened was that DeepSeek then announced that it was actually running the model on Huawei's Ascend 91C chip, and that these chips are actually being adapted to run inference on models that have been trained with NVIDIA's graphic processing units. So there was a fourth step, because in fact, of course, the United States had been trying to prevent Huawei from making progress and prevent China from developing a serious indigenous semiconductor industry. And this then came with that particular announcement. So, as you said, it drove a coach and horses.
Other point, very closely related to what you're saying. The United States has historically prevented foreign students from working in closely, militarily or otherwise technologically sensitive fields. And of course, DeepSeek did all its work with Chinese trained engineers.
Right. Yes. That's very, very striking. And then, the next step was this dramatic impact of the stock market valuation of its US competitors. As you mentioned, OpenAI. I mean, actually, 5 of the Magnificent 7 saw that dramatic, 750 billion drop in their asset value in one day. Although to some extent, they still, in the case of NVIDIA in particular, it still controls the critical language that is widely used. It's a proprietary coding language that is used in AI. So there are other sort of barriers, if you like, towards standing in the way of developing a more open system. So, those are the things that struck me, but there are many, many things that you actually mentioned. The other one that I found very striking was that almost immediately Australia and the Italian government imposed restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
And in Italy, the Garante is the data protection agency, and it actually submitted a whole series of questions demanding to know how the data was collected, what the sources of the data were, how it was stored, in particular where it was stored. And it was in the light of waiting for answers to these questions that they decided to actually limit its use. But that in a sense seems insane in relation to a system that is actually open source, because I realize, that some data is stored, but if it's an open source system, then that means you can actually see the code. So you actually know exactly what it is doing. You can modify the code yourself. So if you want to use it in Italy, they can actually modify the code in order to make it usable, in the context of the Italian context, or indeed in the Australian context. So, I mean, those were the steps, and I think it was very, very striking. Most critically, probably because it suddenly showed that the idea that the American way is the only way is in fact not the only way, and that a country which the United States has been trying, whose progress the United States has been trying to impede, could actually make as much or greater progress with fewer resources than these giant U.S. corporations. And I think out of that, you start to think that why was China able to do it? And I mean, one reason is that, of course, the restrictions themselves generate a determination, to overcome the limits that are imposed. And I think it's that, that also has quite counterproductive effects for the United States, because, I mean, for example, if you can start to run them on Huawei processors, then you don't need to purchase processors from the United States. So it means that, if you like, the restrictive actions that the United States has engaged in has actually, in a sense, accelerated, some aspects of the speed with which alternative can be developed by potential competitors.
As indeed Huawei and had shown, because they after the U.S. imposition on export of certain types of chips to China, Huawei managed to essentially produce a new phone, which became a huge success, a new operating system, which did not use the US-based Android system and so on. So it really has been quite the thing. But I suppose there's another element, isn't there, Mick, to this whole innovation system, which is that there is something about China's innovation environment right now, which is really working. I mean, these achievements we're talking about are not exceptions. China is leading in so many technologies. It's leading in solar panel technology. It's leading in drone technology. It's leading in so many different aspects of technology. And there must be something about the way in which the whole system operates that is enabling all this. And presumably the way in which the whole system operates in the US, which is not enabling all this.
Yes, I mean, I think one I think one needs to consider the background, to what has happened. I mean, 70 years ago, 70 years ago, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. And so in a sense, it was starting almost from scratch, So, I mean, this progress that it's made has been made just in a period of about 70 years, since the CPC came to power in 1949. But, until really the new millennium, I mean, China was in a sense adopting technologies that had already been developed elsewhere. So it was engaged, if you like, in a kind of process of catch-up industrialization. But, even at the start of the new millennium, to a very large extent, it was very, very reliant on the exports of cheap, standardized, mass-produced goods that were assembled, really. It was kind of processing operations from imported components with relatively low-wage, unskilled labor. And at that point, I mean, China was in a sense determined to try to move up the value chain and to develop its own indigenous research and development and to design its own products and so on. So there is a long background. It actually goes back to the 1980s. It actually goes back even earlier, in fact. But in 2006, the State Council established a science and technology plan, and the aim of that plan was what they call indigenous innovation. It was the core aim of that particular plan. In 2010, they adopted the Strategic Emerging Industries Initiative, and then they developed these programs for research and a series of core technologies. And all of these involve credit measures, they involve human resource development measures, they involve research and development objectives. And that strategic emerging industries plan was basically reaffirmed, in the last 5-year plan. And it's got targets, that relate to 2035, so you're looking at planning with very
Long
long
term.
time horizons.
No,
Then in
mhm.
2015, okay, what I was going to say, in 2015, they established these government guidance funds. And these are guidance funds that take non-controlling equity stakes, in companies, and it's designed basically to guide venture capital. And it's interesting, because many of the private venture funds now play a relatively small role because these government guidance funds have assumed such an extraordinarily important role in relation to a whole series of new technologies. And then there are others, 2015, you had Made in China. And the idea was that China would, in some sectors, be able to start to influence international standards. And developed an internet action plan, for cloud computing, mobile internet, and so on. Internet of Things. And then in 2017, there was a new generation artificial intelligence strategy, with the aim of emerging as a world leader. And you had 2017, you also had a military civil fusion scheme. And then in 2014 and 2018, national integrated circuits industry plans. And two big funds, basically to finance the development of these sectors. So there's a multiplicity, there are others as well, because you go to 2001, the Ministry of Industry and Technology actually established a strategy for developing new energy vehicles. So this is one of the core elements, that has played a critical role, basically. And yet, within 20 years, China, as you said, has actually emerged as a leader in a very, very large number of technologies. That includes, artificial intelligence, drones, high-speed trains, green energy, new energy vehicles, and so on. So this is the first thing, that this is a consequence of a kind of active strategy of planning industrial development in a context of a society that's on a path, or a transition path to socialism.
No, I mean, at one level, I mean, what you're saying, what prompts me to think is that, of course, at one level, we know, although the hype is always that the private sector engages in innovation and the government should just step back and allow the private sector to do what it wants. But we know from the work of many critical writers that, in fact, the government has been critical to innovation, even in Western societies. I mean, what was Reagan's Star Wars initiative, but a giant R&D subsidy to big business to sort of innovate in certain kind of an industrial policy, really. We know that DARPA, the internet, exists because of a government initiative, the DARPA initiative, and so on. So we know that the public sector has always played a big role. But what we are witnessing now is that even that, and Biden, for example, continued this tradition in giving, with his Inflation Reduction Act and so on, giving subsidies to corporations to innovate and so on. So there is a continuing government role, but somehow this continuing government role is not having the effect of keeping American technological leadership. So in a certain sense, the bang for the public buck is much bigger in China than it is in the United States. And the United States is able to spend far more money. So that's one element of it. Having said that, there's also a certain kind of smoke and mirrors, a certain kind of tendency to hype what's possible. And again, this hype is also part of the culture, it would seem to me, in the United States. So, in the 1990s, the word technology became one of the most fetishized words, as though, there was no technology before the 1990s, whereas, there's technology in everything. There's technology in the first humanoid picking up the first stone to throw at the first animal. I mean, that was technology as well. It involved a certain understanding of what would the effect of throwing a stone would be. Nevertheless, I mean, we made fetishized technology under the influence of people like Alan Greenspan, who were hyping up some mythical productivity revolution, which could not be seen in the productivity figures. And Alan Greenspan said, you can't see it in the productivity figures, but you see it in the stock market. And because the stock market is going up, it must be because productivity is rising and there is no technology bubble. And when the bubble burst in 2000, at least I remember quoting in something I wrote, one commentator who said that basically all the value that had been accumulated in the stock market after 1995 had been wiped out. He said it's as if the last 5 years never happened. So there is a role of hype in all of this. And again, you got hype is still there. President Trump launches this allegedly $500 billion project, but we don't know where most of the money is going to come from. The government is not going to give it anything. So there's all this hype. And then there is another thing, which is that it seems that one very big element in the difference in the US and China today is that in general, it seems to me that capitalists, there are many capitalists and CEOs in China, corporate capitalists in China, but they are somehow willing to live with a lower rate of profit than what is expected in the United States, by a corporate, an elite of corporate CEOs who have been used to the fantastic returns that are made on speculation and so on. So these are some further differences between what's happening in China vis-a-vis what's happening in the US.
Yeah, and my view in a way is that the rate of productivity growth in the United States, largely has progressively declined since the 1970s. I mean, there was an uptick in the second half of the 1990s, but then the downward trend continued, and the uptick didn't reverse the overall, downward movement, and it is clearly a consequence of a lack of investment, industrial investment, manufacturing investment. And that lack of investment is fundamentally, in my view, due to the rate of return on capital. It's that the fact that the rate of return on capital is relatively low means that the investment that occurs in the United States does not occur, in the manufacturing industry. And then, ever since, you talked about the way in which money is directed towards finance, which is what has happened really, with the emergence of market finance, from the 1980s and the 1990s. And what's interesting about that market finance is that it's, associated with the growth, a whole series of expansion and contractions of these financial markets. But these financial markets are, they're based upon, you said they're based upon a kind of hype. What happens is, that there's, if you like, at present you have these AI technologies, and then people think, oh, potentially AI technologies are going to generate huge profits in the future. So people therefore buy these stocks. And because people buy these stocks, the stocks are increasing in value. Other people buy these stocks, and they continue, keep buying these stocks until you get to a point where, well, in the case of the dot-com bubble, suddenly it was realized that these companies are not going to make a lot of money, and so suddenly you have the dot-com crash, and you have a similar process, in relation to the housing market. And earlier, there were other bubbles. So these are investments, that are based on hopes, that something is going to materialize, and then it's suddenly realized that it's not going to materialize. But in terms of concrete products, coming out of that dot-com bubble, there was not a very great deal, and then people are asking today, what is going actually to come out of AI in terms of applications of AI and so on. The contrast in China is that one of the contrasts in China is that there's much, much more emphasis upon investment in the real economy. And, in 2015, China, when it entered the World Trade Organization, China was not recognized as a market economy. It was not recognized as a market economy because it hadn't opened its capital account. And so it was required, it was expected after 15 years, it would acquire status of market economy, but to do so, it had to undertake some opening up of its capital account. And when it did start to open up its capital account, it then had series of serious difficulties. So in 2015, there was a major stock market crash, which cost the government 7 interventions that were exceptionally expensive to stabilize it. And then in 2016, China used, in total, one quarter, that's about $1 trillion of its foreign currency reserves in order to prevent the shorting of the RMB. So after that, you've seen quite strong action against, if you like, financial interests and financial actors. And it's quite interesting, the company that established DeepSeek were initially involved in developing financial models. But, they turned their skills to producing an AI model with extraordinary results. So this is very important. They repeated emphasis, upon the
No, I
importance
just
of
want to
real
interject
investment.
one brief comment, because the extent of financialization in the United States leads many people to lament that in the United States, we have people, our brightest minds don't do industrial engineering, they do financial engineering. But what you're saying is that was the reverse happened in China, that all the bright minds that were being distracted into financial engineering were brought back and refocused on industrial engineering to very great effect.
Yeah, and I think that relates to what happened to some of the platform enterprises and what happened to the real estate sector. I mean, I think that in these sectors, an attempt was made to deal with the financial risks that were being generated, but that also reorientates, skill. Obviously, in the China case, it's critically important, that there's the education system obviously makes a major contribution. I mean, it's very, very clear that the Chinese education system is capable of producing a lot of exceptionally talented people. I mean, in every year, vast numbers of people emerge with degrees, but also higher degrees and with research degrees in the STEM subjects, in science, technology, mathematics, and so on. And I mean, these subjects are given a great deal of emphasis in the school environment, and people are very, very strongly encouraged, to acquire skills in these areas of science and technology. So that creates a sort of set of skills, that plays also a very, very critical role in ensuring, that resources that are directed towards real investment are sustained, and capable of working their way through by virtue of the investment in education and in skilled people working in these areas of life.
No, and I mean, a couple of different points I wanted to make in response to some of the things that very, very important things you've been saying, Mick. Firstly, we were talking about finance and the lack of productive investment. I mean, part of the reason for the vast amount of financial activity that you see is precisely because American corporations have become essentially very reluctant to make productive investments at home.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they don't even make productive investments abroad. On the whole, what's often celebrated by the globalists as the globalization of production does not involve American corporations investing abroad. All they do is they contract with firms that are making their own investments, whether in China or Bangladesh or Indonesia or where have you, to supply them with certain things. So this is a market relation. It is not an ownership relation between these companies. And so they're not even capable of investing. We say we like to think that these companies go and invest in low wage locations, but they're not even investing. It is the Bangladeshis, the Chinese, and the Indonesians that are investing, right? That's another thing. So they're not even investing, but all the profits they manage to suck out of the system, whether they are investing in it or not, simply by appropriating value at different points in the production chain and so on, this money then is sloshing around. And it is only waiting for the next rumor of the next big hype to rush into this market or that market, because it's got to go somewhere. Just this today, actually, there was a column in the Financial Times, basically saying that it doesn't matter. AI may have shocked, DeepSeek rather may have shocked the financial world, and NVIDIA may have lost a lot of money, but no sooner than the market drops, than everybody who says buy the dip comes running in and says, now NVIDIA is a great bargain, buy it at this price. Not because NVIDIA is a great bargain, but because this money has got to go somewhere, and so they will, they'll believe anything. And of course a lot of this buying is done by so-called retail investors. So that means basically people who don't really know very much about the market. So that's just one set of things, is that this is the hype and all the unreality that we see around innovation and so on in the United States is around that. Second thing, of course, is that intellectual property rights, as many experts in innovation studies argue, is the wrong way to go about holding a leadership position. You hold a leadership position through continuous innovation, not by trying to protect your knowledge behind an intellectual property right wall, because, okay, you may protect your processes, but there may be other processes through which the same result can be achieved. And we are seeing the Chinese do it and other people do it day in and day out. So that's a second thing. A third thing is that even though the United States may be giving a lot of subsidies and R&D money to its corporations, the fact is that its corporations are unable to produce innovations. The one thing that sticks in my mind is, of course, the fact that the Russians and the Chinese today have hypersonic missiles. The United States spends so much money on defense, but they don't have hypersonic missiles. Meanwhile, countries as less developed as Iran and Turkey can produce better drones than the Americans can, where the military industrial complex would rather produce overpriced aircraft carriers than they can producing nimble drones. So they're behind even in that. So there's something really corrupt and problematic about this. And a final point about what you said about education. I've been going to China since 2000 and I think it was 4. And so a little over 20 years now. And I have to say, I've seen the Chinese education system expand massively. And I think that, to be sure, there is a certain amount of, what people may criticize as a low standards or something. But I think that this massive investment in education, this massive opening up of higher education to large numbers of young people in China, eventually has succeeded in translating quantity into quality, in the sense that if you produce enough graduates who may not have the absolute best knowledge or standards in the world, but nevertheless they know something. And then out of each university, out of each cohort of students graduating, there will always be those few who really took it to heart, who really learned a lot, and they go up and advance further. And of course, as time progresses, as more and more people compare Chinese institutions with other institutions, quality, of course, also improves. I'm sure that has been happening in China as well. So I think that China has, and therefore China is today in the forefront of things like producing scientific papers on a number of key technological areas, including things like quantum computing, I hear. So,
I mean, on that last point, I mean, I think the standards in mathematics, science, and technology are extremely high. In secondary schools, they are very high. The levels of attainment of students compare exceptionally well with those in many Western countries. And I mean, even in schools in relatively less affluent neighborhoods, there are very, very high levels of attainment. Outside of those areas, there's a very, very strong emphasis upon learning, basically upon facts, learning very large amount of factual information. It's amazing, just the sorts of things that my colleagues or even people that I meet know. I mean, they have a lot of knowledge, factual knowledge about the world, which is very striking. It's also an exceptionally competitive system. I mean, basically everyone knows their position in a class. So it's highly competitive. And I mean, that highly competitive system, as you get in some other East Asian countries like Korea, that obviously is producing quite positive outcomes. And I mean, what, DeepSeek and these other steps show is that China also has this capacity to create very creative people, to train and educate very, very creative people. So, I mean, that's one of the great successes. But I wanted to, some of the things you said I thought were very interesting. I mean, you spoke about, the way in which US corporations basically have invested, let's say, in other parts of the world. Um, well, they have products made for them, and then of course they own the intellectual property, and they also um, are involved often in the kind of design and the sort of high-end professional jobs, and they appropriate a very high share of value added. And I mean that was precisely, the problem that China confronted, because they were at the low end of the value chain. They were on the part of the smile curve that generated very little value added. It meant that incomes were low. So, I mean, that is at odds, with their goal, which is to improve the quality of the lives of all Chinese people. So, I mean, they had to step out of that position in an extremely unfair international division of labor. So that what is at stake is, if you like, the issue of creating a new, more equitable international division of labor in which all countries, if you like, can play positive roles, and they can raise productivity, income per head, living standards, eliminate poverty, and so on. And I mean, to me, that relates to your second point. And you said that, I mean, you're right, innovation and constant innovation is absolutely vital. But what is also vital is that the results of innovation, that new products, that new technologies diffuse, that they spread, and that their spread is not limited, by the appropriation of massive rents by a few giant corporations in a small part of the world. I mean, I know you're reluctant to talk about industrial revolutions, but there have been a series of industrial revolutions, and there have been a series of new technologies, if you like, new forces of production. And often, if these Schumpeterians say that growth occurs when these innovations diffuse, and it stops when the markets are saturated. But these markets have been saturated when, in the world, vast numbers of people are still living in extreme poverty. So they don't escape outside the limits of a relatively restricted range of countries. And that's because there are so many obstacles facing the diffusion of knowledge. That's why open source. That's why the sharing of knowledge and technology is so central, because it's that which, in a sense, will enable productivity to rise not only in the currently richest parts of the world, but in many, many other parts of the world. So I think that is very important. What enables knowledge, technology to diffuse, be shared, and to, if you like, drive us in the direction of common prosperity. So, I mean, these are all points, that relate to what you said. But I mean, if I just bring something else in, the question is, why is the rate of profit so low in capitalist countries? And I think, well, I mean, all right, Marx had a story. He said he thought there was a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. When it falls, basically, in the past, if you think about in the past, what happens is you have an economic crisis. And in an economic crisis, a lot of capital is destroyed. I mean, if you call it creative destruction, if you like, old capacity is destroyed, and new capacity is created. But normally, the old is largely destroyed with devastating social consequences, because you just have to think about the recessions, or the 1930s or the 1970s, when, I mean, tragic effects, in the United States and European countries, when a lot of old industries were shut down and communities were destroyed and people were placed on the unemployment heap, for the rest of their lives. So these things occur at huge social costs. I'm very struck, that, in the financial crisis, not a lot, I mean, right, a lot of people lost their homes, but I mean, not a lot of capital was destroyed. And ever since then, we've had this phase of secular stagnation because of a lack of investment. Now, in China, it's very interesting because there's a saying called "xian li hou po," and that's actually often said these days, by the Chinese government in various documents. The saying goes back to Mao Zedong, and it means, first build and then destroy. That's very interesting. So the idea then is you build the new, and then if you can, you improve, because they talk about, they don't want to destroy the old. They want to make the old, green and more productive, but by transforming it. So but to do that, you can't do that in a system, where people won't invest unless they get a rate of return that's much higher than the rate of return that is currently on offer. Whereas in China, I think, there's this capacity, to direct resources, toward these activities in the full realization that in the medium term, there's going to be very, very positive benefits in terms of improved productivity and then improved living standards. So this is, we can talk about this new quality Xinzhe or new quality productive forces if you want in a moment.
Absolutely. But can
it seems to me
interject? I want to go there, but can I just interject just one thing? I mean, in one sense, of course, you are right. Capitalism seems to assume that when the rate of profit goes down, when there's a recession, then only a wipeout of existing productive capacities will allow regeneration to occur. But actually, I would say that even in the case of the Great Depression, this process of wiping out all productive capacity was interrupted because you had Hoover, who was advised by, I forget who, some big businessman, who said liquidate everything, liquidate the banks, liquidate businesses, liquidate labor, etc., etc. But then of course Roosevelt came to power and he brought in his New Deal. It wasn't enough to stop the recession. It was the war eventually that stopped the recession, but nevertheless that destruction did not necessarily take its full course. And then, of course, in the post-Second World War period, there are economists who have argued that what the Western countries are suffering from is overcapacity and overproduction because not enough of the old capacity is destroyed, apart from madcaps like Mrs. Thatcher, who imposed a 25% reduction on British manufacturing capacity. Practically nobody or no government was going to allow the destruction of all productive capacity and so on. So to some extent, according to these people, what the system is suffering from, and this process has become accentuated since 2008 with the zombie companies that are only able to pay the interest on their debt and not really able to make a profit, etc., etc. So this process has become exacerbated. So in a certain sense, even though they don't have a clear out, they are not succeeding. Because I think the problem remains that it is the rate of profit that is allowed to be the arbiter of how much investment takes place in what sectors, etc., which is not the case in China, as you just pointed out many minutes ago, that, in China, the government has stepped in precisely when the private sector animal spirits seem not to be able to do the job, and the government has stepped in to direct capital to needed sectors and so on. So I think that's really something I just wanted to bring in. But yes, I do want to focus a little bit more on this new quality productive forces, and I want to suggest that it's quite possible that we've discussed many reasons why China is succeeding and the US in particular is failing on the innovation game. But I think one of those things is that perhaps we are at a time in history when developing the productive forces, innovating under the rule of private gain and private profit is no longer producing the cutting edge results. That if you want to produce the cutting edge results, you have to innovate at a social level. Just make a small example. Although US is so big in finance, until recently in the United States, they didn't even use chip credit cards, let alone anything else, like, the credit cards with the little chips in them. Because, in the United States, finance is completely organized in the private sector, whereas many other countries where there are better regulation and so on, they had these innovative things. And in China, payment systems have absolutely exploded. The last time I went there and I tried to pay with cash, they looked at me like I was some dinosaur from some old age, because nobody pays with cash anymore. Payment systems are everywhere. I think partly because China has a better regulated financial sector, which is able to introduce these socially useful innovations without private profit being an obstacle. So maybe you could take
it. I mean, I just want to come back to what you said about Roosevelt. The point, yeah, you're right. This kind of liberal market model rests upon the idea that, if you like, capital will be destroyed and then, the new will be built. But I mean, what Roosevelt did is actually showed that there is another way, which is that public investment, can start to address these issues. And I think, in a sense, that was the start of I mean, people say a golden age era, people of a very exceptional era. I'm very struck by Piketty, when he points out that, well, that era from the First World War, but right up to the 1980s, really was a period of a great convergence, of a compression of inequality. But he often says that that period was completely exceptional and completely untypical of the entire history of capitalism.
Yes.
So we are dealing here, with a very particular period, in which, I mean, they weren't. I mean, I wouldn't say they were strictly capitalist economies. They were essentially mixed economies with a partial decommodification of labor, with the welfare state and so on. And they were very successful, until the 1970s. But then in the 1970s, we reverted, to liberalism, if you like, came back, to rule the roost. And in that context, as you say, you're absolutely right. Basically, it seems as if capitalism is incapable, of developing, the productive forces in the context in which we find ourselves at this time. I mean, the United Kingdom is another extraordinary case. I mean, it, the consequence was of destroying industry without building new industry, that it's become almost completely deindustrialized and almost entirely dependent upon, the financial sector in the City of London, and then a service economy in the rest of the country, and a service economy that's associated with extraordinarily low productivity, low income, insecure employment, and driving, if you like, what is a profound crisis, in that country. I mean, Alan, the economic historian, he's just written a new article basically about Britain, and it's very, very pessimistic. But that's, from sort of the perspective of a very, very good, but mainstream economic historian. So, I mean, in China, they have started to speak a lot about new quality productive forces, or high quality development. I mean, this is a kind of poor notion that is repeated all the time, and basically is referring to material, intellectual, technological capabilities, that are largely associated with this fourth industrial revolution. And then the idea is that they have this capacity to drive productivity growth. They can improve the satisfaction of human needs. They can improve the quality of life. And as you said at the beginning, this concept derives from Marx, right? Marx used it to refer to the material, technological, intellectual capabilities that are involved in meeting human needs. And I mean, developing the productive forces, if you like, is ways of meeting human needs in a more satisfactory way. And I've argued several times, that basically growth, prosperity, they basically reflect the diffusion of these new products, of new technologies, and so on. What I wanted to say about China is that this is linked now very strongly with the idea that China is embarking on a new modernization path that is really distinct from the modernization path on which the Western world has pursued. And it's interesting, because in a sense it's based upon this development of these new quality productive forces, but it is also, well, they also speak of spiritual civilization, right? Of ecological civilization. So and also, with a more active participation, of grassroots in political life and so on, which is in fact already very active in very many places. So this is very, very striking, that it's seen not just as involving, industrial transformation, but it involves, rural modernization. It involves the development of new infrastructure. It involves the development of a new pattern of urbanization, with much less reliance, upon mobility by vehicles and so on. So it's about a transformation, not just of industry, but of many aspects of life, and at the same time addressing the ecological crisis, that the world confronts. So I think that's something that, one must always bear in mind, and you have to look at these multiple dimensions. And I mean, there are actions, on multiple dimensions. I mean, these things are often pulled together in an overall concept of common prosperity as being the goal that is going to orient, China's future development.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I mean we should probably be winding down this conversation, but in closing, I would say that basically what I see China is doing, particularly at a time when China has a very, very big industrial economy. There's a point beyond which it doesn't necessarily need more, and therefore growth may appear to slow down in certain ways, growth measured in a certain way. But I think that its emphasis on a more all around qualitative notion of growth, like you say, involving the human or spiritual, even cultural development of people, of ecological issues, creating a natural environment which is a pleasure to live in, etc. All of these are now becoming part of a conception. And I think the more China takes this very seriously, I think the more it will be a model for the rest of the world to follow, rather than this mad idea of more and more things to consume, which can only, I think, lead to well, environmental and all sorts of other kinds of disaster. So a few last thoughts, Mick, and then we can wind
Well,
down.
no, I agree. I probably should say, I mean, China, of course, is a very important manufacturing power. It's also, I mean, I think I've said on other occasions, it's also important to recognize, however, that it also needs the rest of the world, and in many ways. I mean, first of all, I've said many times, it's got 20% of the world's population and 5% of the world's arable land. It hasn't got it's probably only got 6-7% of many of the world's key resources. It's got about 6-7% of the world's water. So it's a country that is very, very dependent upon imports of a whole range of goods and services, that are produced in other parts of the world, which creates very strong mutual dependence. But I think what's also striking, is that if these developments in manufacturing are shared, then in a sense, these capacities spread to other parts of the world. And I mean, if they spread to other parts of the world, in a sense that creates a whole series of opportunities for other countries. And I mean, it creates a world which, in a sense, is also more beneficial to China because, I mean, other parts of the world are richer and people have a higher quality of life and so on. And that impacts positively on China. I mean, I was very struck, the last few days, the Prime Minister of Thailand, visited China, and there were a lot of discussion, of two projects. One is the rail project, from basically Yunnan, right, to the capital to Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, crossing Laos and so on. And the other is this idea of a canal, to bypass, the Malacca Straits. So I mean, these sorts of projects are also very important, because they're things, I mean, obviously, Thailand is very interesting because they will collect revenues, from transit through the canal and so on. And also, I mean, it's interesting, this railway already crosses Laos. Rural people in Laos, can load products onto the train, to ship them to the Chinese market. So, China is, if you like, trying to work with other countries as well, and it's quite important not to see it as trying to adopt a dominant role in the world. I think.
Well,
I
exactly. I
think
mean,
that's what I would want to finish.
yeah, and this is it. I mean, this is just really what people who love to call China as imperialist as any other country, as the US, etc., completely fail to see is that China does not want a relationship of subordination and dominance. China wants to create a sort of an ever expanding ripples of development around itself that will include more and more of the world into it and make it a much more stable. Imperialism and domination create instability, create chaos, whereas spreading prosperity through equal partnerships, through sharing innovations and other things, such things, creates greater stability, greater peace, greater prosperity all around. So yeah, this has been a really interesting discussion. I think
Okay.
maybe we should call it, can we finally bury the idea that only capitalism can be innovative, I think, or something like that.
I
But
think most
anyway.
certainly, most certainly. Um,
So thanks so much, Mick, and thanks everyone for watching this. And please like and share this video with lots of other friends who may be interested. And we'll see you in another couple of weeks. Bye bye.
okay, thank you. Goodbye.